My name is Isabelle Charmantier. I'm the head of collections here at the Linnean Society. Today I will present you a manuscript from Carl Linnaeus's collections. And this is a manuscript from his younger days. But I thought, while I'm aware that probably most of you are entirely knowledgeable and know exactly who Carl Linnaeus is, I thought I would start with a short presentation on Carl Linnaeus, just just to introduce the man before I go on to present the manuscript. So this is Carl Linnaeus, both in his youth and in his old age. Linnaeus was born in 1707. And here on the left, we have his wedding portrait. And on the right, his portrait of as an elderly gentleman 3 years before he died and just 1 year after he suffered his first stroke. And you can see that on both portrait, his signature flower, so the plant that bears his name, Linnea borealis, features quite prominently. Here he's holding it, and on the older portrait, it's on his lapel. Lapel. I knew I'd get this wrong. And in this, the wedding portrait, he is leaning on one of his most famous books, Systema Naturae. And finally, the older portrait, he is wearing the Order of the Night Star, by which he was ennobled in 1761. So Linnaeus was mostly famous in his lifetime for his systems of classification. And he first published them very early on. He was 28 when the first edition of his very important work, Systema Naturae, or the Systems of Nature, was published when he was in Leiden in Holland. This book, I wish I could show it to you because it's very big. It's a double folio, but it wouldn't fit in the camera. And it aims to classify the whole of the natural world in just 11 pages. And the way Linnaeus does that is that he uses double page tables in order to classify the 3 kingdoms of nature. So here at the top left, we have the kingdom of animals, the kingdom of minerals down there, and then what was probably Linnaeus' favorite discipline, botany, so the kingdom of vegetables. And in order to classify the kingdom of vegetables, the table that you see there is prefaced by a diagram which explains the 24 classes of Linnaeus's most famous sexual system. So that's 1735, he's 28 at the time, and that book really launched a career which lasted throughout his lifetime. And Systema Naturae was edited in various editions. I think it went through 12 editions through his lifetime, and there was a 13th posthumously published. This is the 10th edition of Systema Naturae. So you see, we've gone through from 3 tables to 3 hefty volumes, and that's because in the space of these 20 odd years, Linnaeus became a very well-known professor of botany at the University of Uppsala, and acquired a network of correspondence which enabled him to supplement and enrich the first edition. So each edition kind of grew and grew and grew. And this is just one of his books. He published many others. Systema Naturae 10th edition is mostly famous because it is the first time that Linnaeus used his binomial nomenclature for the first time for animals. For plant, it was a little bit later in the 1753 Species Plantarum. Now, the binomial nomenclature is what has lasted, really. It's his inheritance. We do not use Linnaeus's classification, but we do use his binomial nomenclature, by which we name every organism scientifically using a genus name followed by a species name. And you see here the page where man is classified as within the class Mammalia and the order Primates. So primates, mammals and primates, words that Linnaeus first used and that we still use today, obviously. And then this is the first time that we have Homo sapiens as a binomial name in print. So the genus name here in capital letters and the specific epithet here, so Homo sapiens. So this is just an overview of his later work, but I want to come back to when Linnaeus was a student, because that's the manuscript that I'm going to talk about today. So as I said, he was born in 1707 in Stenbrohult in the south of Sweden. He went to school a little bit north from there in Växjö, where his talents for studying the natural world were recognized by his teachers, who put pressure on his father, who was a pastor, to not send Linnaeus in the similar path, but to for him to go and study medicine. And so in 1728, Linnaeus went to the University of Lund, but that university was not so good. So in 1729, he relocated to the University of Uppsala, further up north. And the manuscript that I'm going to show you starts with his school days when he was in Växjö, 1726. Some of the pages are dated up until 1730. So it spans all these kind of learning years through his time at school, then in university in Lund and in Uppsala. And just to put a little bit of a story behind the manuscript, I'm just going to show you another manuscript that is in our collection that I haven't brought up. But when he was in both in Lund and in Uppsala, Linnaeus's talent, curiosity and intelligence brought him to the attention of various professors. And one of these was Olof Celsius. Olof Celsius was the uncle of Anders Celsius of the thermometer fame. Olof Celsius was so impressed by Linnaeus that he offered him bed and board. And we have in our collection this plan of Dr. Celsius' house, where rooms have been indicated and show what they contain. So we have here Linnaeus's bedroom. There were a couple of students living with him at the time, probably in the bedrooms next to him. Next to him was the room allocated to Mrs. Celsius. And then further up, we have Dr. Celsius. And right on the other side of the courtyard was Bibliotek, the library. So it so happened that when Linnaeus first became a guest and a tutor to Celsius' son in this house, he did not have access to the library. But one of his co-tutors living next to him did. And what Linnaeus did is he befriended the boy, who would bring books to him from the library into his bedroom, and he would study these late at night. And one night, Mrs. Celsius, whose room was indeed next to him, and we know all this because it's described in Linnaeus's autobiography. She noticed light under his door. The next morning, she went to her husband and said, "You need to tell Linnaeus to blow off his candle, or blow out his candle before he goes to sleep, because I think he's falling asleep with the candle still on, and he'll end up putting fire to the house." So the next evening, Dr. Celsius came to Linnaeus's bedroom, found that there was indeed light coming through the door, opened the door and found Linnaeus not asleep as he thought he would be, but studiously taking notes from books in his library. And I think some of the notes that I'm going to show you in this manuscript probably date from that time when he was using the library, first of Dr. Celsius and then of Dr. Rudbeck, who was another tutor who provided him with shelter in his house. So this is just a little story with which I'm going to finish this PowerPoint, and we are now going to move to the manuscript. So let me switch videos. There we go. So here is the manuscript I will talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. So before we go into the manuscript, and sorry, just give me 2 seconds. I'm going to bring my notes up next to the screen. Here we go. I just want to start with the makeup of the book before we start opening it. As you see, it's covered with marbled paper, and Will let me know if it becomes unfocused throughout. And this was quite a common way of covering cheaper books at the time, or cheaper notebooks. We also see that the foredge is very irregular, and that's because initially it was not, probably not a notebook. I think what Linnaeus did is that he initially took notes on various different folders of paper, which we call quires. So you see that they're all slightly of different shape and sizes. And what's happened then is that Linnaeus has himself sewed it, or had it sewn into a notebook, and that enabled him to put it in some sort of order. So sorry, I'm just checking something on my screen. So if we look now at the title page, so we're just opening it, many of Linnaeus's manuscripts are quite immaculate. They have very little corrections or amendments or crossing outs, which makes me think that he was probably using drafts before copying it clean, whatever information he was copying in here. And a lot of them, many of them, most of them have a title page, much like a printed book would. So we have at the top, Caroli Linnei here, so from Carl Linnaeus. Then the title that he's given to this Compendium of Note, Manuscripta Medica, is the first volume. We also have this third volume in our collection, so there must have been a second volume, which has since been lost. And then it says Fragments of Natural History. And because he's put the together later, he's arranged all the section in some sort of order. So we start with notes on mineralogy, then botany, zoology, then that very convenient kind of category of miscellaneous, and then finally excerpts from a scientific journal of the time, the Actorum Lipsiensium. And then he's dated it much as a printed book would be published on a certain day. So he says it was begun in the month of August 1727. So he's still at school in Växjö then. And it was finished in 1730. And by then he's moved to the University of Uppsala. So let's start and open it and leaf through it. And I will skip the mineralogy section, which is very, very short, to come to the botany section. So what is immediately striking is that a lot of this book is about classification and methods of classifications of other authors before him. What were other naturalists doing before Linnaeus? How were they classifying and ordering the world? And the first classification of plants we encounter is that of a French botanist of the 17th century, Joseph Piton de Tournefort. So here is the method of plants of Tournefort. And you'll see that the way he's laid out the information is very similar to the way he would print and lay out the information in the future Systema Naturae. So the main tenets of the classification of Tournefort, the main classes, are explained through a diagram at the beginning. And here we have all the classes from Tournefort. And then in order to go into more detail of the orders and genera within these classes, Linnaeus has used a table which goes on for quite a few pages. And so here we have, for example, monopetals, Campaniformi, and that's the first class of Tournefort. What is also striking when you start looking at this in detail is that Linnaeus has not only copied the genera which are here from Tournefort, he's also started correcting them. So you see some genera name are crossed out. Belladonna, for example, has been added on later, because the ink is slightly different. So Linnaeus here is not only merely copying, he's also thinking about this classification and finding faults with it. So this is all Tournefort, and you can see it goes on for quite a long time. And then we come to the classification of another botanist of the time, the German Augustus Rivinus or Augustus Bachmann. And the information is laid out in exactly the same way, with a a diagram on the left, and then the table that goes on for a few pages enumerating and placing the genera within their proper orders within these classes. Okay, and I could go on because there's quite a lot of similar classification. The other thing that is also present in this book are quite a few lists. Linnaeus had a very systematic mind, and he liked very visual way of displaying information. So we've seen diagrams, we've seen tables, we will see a few drawings, but there's also quite a few lists in here. And so this is another one that goes on for a few pages. It's alphabetically arranged, and it aims to look at the importance of names, and specifically here, genera names. So I don't know if you can see, but at the top here we have male, so wrong, and recte, right. And this is simply a list of genera name which Linnaeus feels are wrong and what they should be replaced with. And it's interesting because the first one is Achillea, which he thinks should be replaced by millefolium, but in fact, and that's yarrow. In fact, the scientific name for yarrow now is Achillea millefolium. So not all of it was applied in his later work. Another example further on, when we get to the letter P, for example, he doesn't much like names that come from the common names. So if you look down here, we see Pes leonis, which is lion's foot, which he wants to replace with Alchimilia, and that is lady's mantle today. I don't know, shall I try and do a close-up? Do you think that might work, Will? Okay. Thing is, I should say I see my image in reverse on the screen, which is not helpful. But here we go. And Pes leonis is right here. Okay, I'll go on. The next page I selected has a few drawings. Now this is quite unusual. Actually, most historians that have studied Linnaeus's manuscripts have said how bad a draftsman Linnaeus was. He just simply was not very good at drawing. And that is most apparent in his Lapland journal, actually. If you go online, you can browse and go and find the reindeer, and then you'll understand why historians have decided that he wasn't a very good draftsman. But actually, that's not really the point for Linnaeus. It's not about the beauty or the aesthetic of the drawing. Really, it's a method, once again, of memorization, of laying out where the important parts are on the page for him to remember. A little further along, we have yet another list, and this is one where he lists all the names. So again, we come back to this importance of naming, which will be apparent in his later work, especially with the establishment of the binomial nomenclature. This is a list of plants that have their origin in Greek mythology. So you will recognize some of the name, Gentiana, Circea, and then he goes on to explain in Latin that it's from the poetess and witch Circe. I should say something I haven't said is that most of this notebook is in Latin, because it's made up of notes that were taken from books that Linnaeus was reading, and really the only Swedish that comes in is from lecture notes that I will show you in a bit. So lectures that were taking place in Uppsala. So I think that is it for botany. I think, oh no, hang on. There is another list here. That's it. So another thing that he's that he's interested in is, again, how do you make up botanical and plant names? And this will be laid out by him in his Philosophia Botanica of 1751, where he really has all the rules of how to name a new genus. And here he lists all the genera that were named after previous botanists by botanists. So, for example, we have here all the plant names that were named by Tournefort in honor of other botanists. So we've got Plumeria here for Charles Plumier. And again here, the plant names named by Plumier in honor of botanists, and you'll find Magnolia here in honor of Pierre Magnol, who was the who worked at the Botanical Gardens in Montpellier. Okay, so we leave botany behind and we go to quadrupeds, which is what mammals were called before before the 1758 edition of Systema Naturae. So here we go. So we've left botany, we've gone into zoology now, and this is a classification of quadruped. And I've tried to look for this, and I don't know who this is from. The text at the top does indicate perhaps Johnston, who was a Polish naturalist of the 1660s. But it's very, very small and I can't quite read it. But anyway, this is a classification of quadrupeds, which divides them between ungulates, so hooved, and unguiculata, so ones that only have one toenail, literally, where you find the elephants and the camel. Now, what I'm going to show you next is a little drawing of a bat, which came into the quadrupeds, not by Linnaeus, but by the English botanist John Ray. And I'm going to try and do a close-up. Here we go. Hopefully, let me try and focus it again. And that bat has, that little drawing of a bat has intrigued us. There's, you know, Vespertilio, there's a whole description here. But it's intrigued us because it's very close to a specimen that we have in our collections that I have actually brought up, and I will place, hopefully you can see that despite the glass. I don't really want to take the glass off. So this is a specimen that has been in our collections for ages. Actually, it was kept in it was housed with the Linnean collection of insects for many years. And there's a little note that comes with it that says there is no evidence to prove that it was part of Linnaeus's collection. But we would like to think that it might be, and we are working with Steph Holt, who's a naturalist from the Natural History Museum in London, and she is thinking of ways that we could establish whether this was part of the Linnean collection. If it was, it might well be a new type specimen, which would be very exciting. But the similarities, I guess, inevitably, because they're both displayed with wings outstretched, is quite striking. Okay, and we move on to birds and John Ray. So this is the classification of John Ray, English botanist, yes, mostly botanist, but also published books on fish and birds and ornithology in the 17th century. And it's interesting if you compare what Linnaeus has extracted here out of Ray's classification. He's really only copied the most well-known species. So for example, and of course there's a hierarchy to the classification. We start with the eagle, the vulture, falcons, etc., and then the classification continues on the other side. These little envelopes that are scattered within contain plant material, and it's a way to keep them safe, but at the same time keep where they lived, and they have lived for the past few hundred years. And these are the lecture notes that Linnaeus attended, which were given by Professor Rudbeck. Actually, they start here. And you can see his first lecture, Prelectio 1, took place on the 29th of October, 1728. And every single lecture is dated, and it's all about the classification of bird. And when Linnaeus could not attend the class, he got his notes from someone else. And for example, these are notes that he were communicated by Dr. Artedius. Now, Artedius was Per Artedi, who was Linnaeus's very close friend in Uppsala, like him, immensely interested in the natural world and its classification, and had started working on classifications of fish, especially. The two men and the two students ended up together in Holland in the 1730s, 1735, and unfortunately Per Artedius drowned in a canal in Amsterdam, and so Linnaeus took over his work and continued it for him. So a lot of his classification of fish are from Artedius, and here is a classification of fish. Again, it doesn't actually say where this is from, but you'll see that because this is before mammals and before 1758, the dolphins and seal we have here, and the whales are classified within the fish. And I'm aware we're reaching half past one, so I'm going to finish with some insects, which are probably the nicest page because they're nicely illustrated. So this is a classification of insects, and you really see here how it almost looks like a title page on its own. You can really feel that this was a section on its own that came into the manuscript later on, because it's almost like yes, the title page. And this is all from Johannes Johnston, his book of 1653, book 3 on insects of his natural history. And as I said, so we start off again with a diagram which shows the classification of Johnston for insects, and then it's followed by a series of notes which are illustrated with little drawings. I'm going to try and, unfortunately, there we go. Do some close-ups. Now these were not drawn from life by Linnaeus. If you go to Johnston work, you see that he basically copied the engravings that are in Johnston, and there's a few more here. Right there you see female and male of, I couldn't tell you what that is. Sorry, I should have prepared that. There we go, and it's followed by Godart's classification of insects, Swammerdam's classification of insects, for some reason with more drawings and a cut within the paper here. And then shells, and it goes on and on and on, and towards the end, as the summary says, the content page says at the end, it's extract from a scientific journal of the time, and on the last page, and I will stop here, is a list of all of Linnaeus's pupils from whom he got some money for private lessons. The amounts are here, the names are here, and the dates are here. And it amused me yesterday when I was looking at this that the first date is 1722, when Linnaeus was basically 15. But the sum acquired from this David Samuel Kulas was 0, because it was apparently a reciprocal arrangement. So I'm not sure what that meant, but I suspect it was two schoolboys just exchanging information. And it's 1:30, so I think I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to revert the camera back onto myself, and I'm very happy to take any questions you may have. There we go.
Before we get started, I'll just say thank you, Isabelle. That was really wonderful. As the librarian for the Society, I'm normally interested in the printed books, and so the manuscripts are something of uncharted territory for me, really. So it's always really wonderful to have an expert talk us through one of Linnaeus's manuscripts. That was really wonderful. We've got a couple of questions popping up in the chat. The first one, and I think if we had £1 for every time we've been asked this, is about the wearing of white gloves.
Yeah, do you know what? I was going to actually say something at the beginning, just, but I forgot. Yes, so we archivists don't really, and I suspect librarians for rare books is the same. We don't really wear gloves. If you wear cotton or neoprene gloves, you lose the sense of touch, and the risk of tearing the pages is much greater than damaging it. So what we do is that we wash our hands before touching material, and we avoid putting hand cream on. So I did duly wash my hands just before the talk, so I could handle the manuscript safely.
The next question is, what sort of ink did he use? I think I could hazard a guess, but maybe you would like to.
Oh, you hazard your guess.
I think it's probably iron gall ink.
Yes,
would be my estimate, which is made out of sort of tannic acid and oak galls. You can find out more about how iron gall ink is made, but it was common right up until until the end of the 19th century and onwards. That would be my best guess.
I agree.
Any idea of which plant was used to produce the papers? Well, I suspect it probably wasn't a plant-based paper at all. I think in this period it would probably be rag paper, so paper that's made out of fabric fibers like linen fibers. You basically make them wet, you leave them in a big pile until they start to sort of decompose a bit, and then you put the fibers into a paper mold, and paper made at that period was usually rag pulp paper rather than wood pulp.
So there's secondary link to plants.
Yeah, that's right. I think plants get a hat tip later on as well, but maybe we'll come to it.
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Nicol. It is linen, but it's from the cloth made out of the plant. So that's what I mean. There's that extra step in between.
Someone messaged me directly and said to remind attendees that Linnaeus' home and garden is still present in Uppsala. And yes, it absolutely is. I've never had the pleasure of visiting, but I believe, is it Hammarby? His estate is a tourist attraction. And there is a Linnean garden at the University of Uppsala, which I'm told is very splendid and is top of my list to go and see when we're allowed to travel again. This is an amazing book. What is done to protect the pages and details from potential damage?
So first and foremost is digitized. So we don't, I'm probably the one who handles it the most because it is one of my favorite manuscripts, and I usually take it out when there's a tour, but as we're not having tours at the moment, that's probably very good for it. It gives it a rest. But yes, it's digitized, and it's been quite comprehensively catalogued, so that access is not through the manuscript at first. It's through either our online collections or the archive catalogue. And yes, because it's digitized, we don't take it out that much, and then it's kept in a little box, which is itself in a box, and that's in the collection store, which is a very secure area. So it's out of the light, it's in a relatively stable environment, temperature and relative humidity wise. And I think that's probably protecting it for hopefully another few centuries.
And actually at the end of the chat, one of the participants asked for a link to the digitized version, which is on our online collections. And I've popped that link in the chat box if you want to have a browse in your own time. What else? It is very interesting that there are real plants between the pages. Does the text on those pages mention them? Did you see real plant samples, or were they sketches of plants?
No, there are. It's interspersed with real plant samples. That's a really good question. But I'm afraid that's not one I can answer, simply because I'm not a botanist. And when I catalogued this, I didn't have a look at so we enclosed them. What I would need to do is go back to our honorary botany curator. So we have curators who help us look after the biological collections, and Dr. Mark Spencer is our botany curator, and if he identified what the plants are, then I could probably see whether the text mentions them, but that would be a nice exercise. Yeah.
All right, scrolling down. Christian asks, as a Swede, I'm curious how the collections ended up in London. Isabelle, do you want to?
Sure. So Linnaeus dies in 1778, and then after him, there was a bit of a kerfuffle between his widow and his son, who was also called Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus the younger was also professor of botany at the University of Uppsala, and he did end up with the collections for another few years, but he died quite young in his 40s in 1783, and at that point the collections reverted back to Linnaeus's widow, and she put them up for sale. She sent letters in a few places across Europe, but one of these reached Sir Joseph Banks, who was the patron of natural history in London at the time. And Banks by then, so this is 1783, he'd already gone around the world with James Cook, and he had a huge amount of material and specimens to catalogue and go through himself. So that's my conjecture, but I suspect that's why he didn't want to purchase them. But with him, when the letter arrived, he was having one of his botanical breakfasts with a young graduate, freshly arrived from the University of Edinburgh, called James Edward Smith. And he counseled James Edward Smith to purchase these collections because that would really set him up in his career as a botanist. And so Smith turned to his father to ask for the money to buy the collections, not only the collections, but also a house in London to be able to house these collections and open them up to other naturalists. And so that's what happened. The transaction took place, the collections were packed, put on a ship, and left Stockholm harbour. The story goes that as the ship was leaving Stockholm, the King of Sweden was coming back from being abroad, realized what was happening and how the collections of Linnaeus were a national treasure, and sent a ship in pursuit to try and retrieve them. But that, I think, is entirely fabrication, and it was probably fabricated by Smith to big up his acquisition of the Linnean collections. So they were purchased, put in London, opened up to naturalists. Smith then did a huge amount of work to really promote the Linnean systems of classification. He translated quite a few of Linnaeus's work, and so created a kind of a whole network of naturalists who became Linneans and promoted the Linnean system for quite a long time. And in fact, one of the keen promoters was Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who published a whole poem on the sexual system of classifying plants called The Love of the Plants. And then after that, the systems go and stop being used so much. But yeah, sorry, I'll stop.
Let's see. Gosh, lots of really nice comments. People saying they enjoyed the talk. That's really nice to read. Carmen asks, it survived centuries without controlled temperature and humidity. Do you think it has affected its condition?
I don't think so, actually. I think it's pretty, I have it here. It's pretty sturdy. It's 18th century paper is actually really, really good. We were just looking at a much, not much later, actually. It was 1820s, 1810s. And the paper is not as good, is falling apart already. 19th century paper starts to become much more acidic because it's just made differently. But this is very, very good paper, and it's survived thus far in great part because of the paper. And I hesitate to say this, but the Linnean manuscripts have been lying unstudied for many, many years. I think most people interested in the Linnean collections have concentrated on the plants, on the butterflies, on the insects, the fish, so the specimens and the books. The manuscripts, up until they were catalogued, which is what, 5 years ago, have not really been touched that much. And I think that must have helped. Less handling will have helped his preservation.
they're quite challenging materials to work with, because not only are they written in a sort of Neo-Latin a lot of the time, some bits in Swedish as well, you also have to contend with Linnaeus's handwriting, which isn't the easiest, even by 18th century standards. So there's, I always think, quite a small Venn diagram of scholars who were really sort of equipped to work with the Linnean manuscripts. You know, you have to be interested in natural history and biology, but you also have to have quite good Latin and be a reasonable paleographer, and that sort of shrinks down the number of people who are going to be sort of knocking at their door, if you like. So I think benign neglect is possibly a description of how they've come down to us through the centuries. Gemma asks, thank you for an inspiring talk. I have a question. As you said, Linnaeus drew some illustrations to memorize the appearance of species in spite of his terrible drawing technique. Did he apply his method to his drawing later? What is Linnaeus's take on botanical illustration?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. And I wrote a whole paper on this quite a while ago. So I'm going to try and remember. Basically, for Linnaeus, you cannot describe a genus. So it's impossible to depict a genus. And you can only describe a specimen of a species. There is that factor. The other factor is that the price of illustrating books was prohibitive in the 18th century, and Linnaeus had been a poor student. He wrote an entire a section, I think in Philosophia Botanica actually, where he describes botanical books as being too expensive for the majority of people who want to have knowledge of botany. So he, between these two factors, you end up with books that are mostly not illustrated, but are rather lists and catalogs of plants or animals or minerals that use extremely precise vocabulary to replace that illustration, and to give the description not by an image but by words. And this is why I emphasized the importance of his thinking about names and his thinking about the vocabulary. It's extremely important for Linnaeus, and it has to be as systematic as the system of classification, because there are words that have to be used for certain descriptions. I was going to say something else and then it escapes me now. But yes, that would be part of my answer.
So lots of questions. Brad Scott asks, how widespread were Linnean societies across Europe? I think I could have a stab at that maybe, but certainly there are a couple in France. There was a Linnean society in Lyon and one in Normandy. I think there might even have been one in the south of France. Probably our most famous sister society is in New York. And then there was another in New South Wales, which I think is now defunct. But there were certainly pockets of...
Yeah, some of these, the one in Paris, there was one in Paris actually, and I think it disappeared around, I don't want to say something wrong, but I think it's around the time of the French Revolution or just after. And then there's one in Uppsala as well. So there are a few.
He was sort of almost a cult figure in some ways, I sense. There were celebrations to him in Germany with toasts and beer drinking and Linnean songs. Right up until the 19th century, he was, so long after his lifetime, he was sort of went beyond simple hero worship, I think. He was, and Rousseau was an enormous admirer and said, I read you and worship you. And he was, you know, the prince of botanists and all the rest of it. So his admirers were many, I think. How many of those groups then sort of organized themselves into Linnean societies, I'm not sure, but certainly there's more than half a dozen, I would say, dotted around. As we go down, Tishen asks, have Darwin and Wallace or Joseph Banks ever consulted these manuscripts in their studies on classification? That's a really good question.
That is a really good question. Both Darwin and Wallace were fellows of the Linnean Society. I'm not sure that they came a lot. I mean, Wallace was in the Malay archipelago for quite a few years, even went. But sorry, I don't know is the answer. It's a very good question. I suspect not, because as I said, the manuscripts were not that well used. They were not properly catalogued until the 1930s by a professor called Professor Ugla from Uppsala, who came on and off. And actually, I think they even sent him the manuscripts to catalogue during the war. So, so there wasn't a list really available. So my instinct would be to say no, but I can't be sure.
Joe asks, I'm very interested in the visuality of Linnaeus's work. I've read your paper and you include the quotation that Linnaeus did not use a microscope. Did he use any visual technologies instead of the microscope, or did he use the microscope later?
That's a really
it's quite a big question.
It's a good question. I don't think so. No, I think for him it was about the characters that you could see with your eye, because you're in the field. You've already got loads of implements, to have with you. So most of his classifications depend on what you can see with the naked eye. And in fact, I mean, you probably know about the system of classifying plants. It's extremely simple. It's dependent on the number of male characters, the stamens, and the female characters, the pistils. And that gives you the class and the order. And anything that you can't see is just lumped into that big class of cryptogamia, which is basically means hidden marriages, because there's no sexual act going on. So if you can't see it, so yeah, sorry, that's a roundabout way of saying I don't think so. I think he did have a lens, but no microscope. But I don't want to say something wrong, so I'll leave it there.
It's a very appropriate question for our first Linnean Lens event.
Yes, that's true.
So a question here from Ala. Oh, about Schupp. I'm 13 years old and I'm really curious to know about Carl Linnaeus' pet raccoon. Did he document any of his findings about raccoons? I happen to know what happened to the raccoon.
Oh, go for it, Will.
Well, I don't know, maybe you should, because I'm not sure if I've got the whole story, but I think Schupp was Linnaeus's pet raccoon. I think Schupp died. And then I believe Carl Linnaeus, being a good scientist, performed a dissection on Schupp and then wrote up his findings. Is that in the manuscripts, Isabelle?
I think it was published as a scientific paper, actually.
Was it?
Yeah, but I'm going to bring Joe in, actually, if you don't mind, Joe, because we had a competition. And if you're 13, we're having a, yeah. Do you want to say a few words, Joe?
Yeah, I know Ala, and it's great to see you. It's great to wave at you. Yes, we are running our next competition, and I'm in discussion with Isabelle and Will about it, which will be starting in September. Really looking forward to that. And I'm also about to announce something over the summer as well, which I know you've emailed me about, so I'll be emailing you back about the official plans for our summer of fun, we'll say. Exploration.
Yes, just to explain to everyone else, we hold annual competition. This first took place when we conserved one of the portraits of Linnaeus, and we launched a competition for I think 11 to, I can't remember what the ages were now, 11 to 15, something like that, to replace the portrait as it was being conserved. And that has morphed into an annual competition. And I think the one last year was to draw Jupe, so the pet raccoon.
We're getting up to 10 to 3. I'm quite happy to stay on and work through some more questions, but I know people probably have other commitments. What do you think, Isabelle? Are you happy to stay on?
I'm happy to stay for another 10 minutes. And
yeah, okay. So Fabata asks, where can one find your article, Isabelle? Oh, Gemma has, I think, given the citation there. I don't know if it's behind a paywall, but...
yes, it is. But if you want it, email me and I'll send it to you.
There you go. Oh, and I think that's it. I've reached the end of my chat window anyway. I did see a hand up in the participants, but it seems to have disappeared now.
Oh, according to Giuseppe, my papers are freely available on ResearchGate.
Are they?
There you go.
Are you losing out on revenue, Isabelle? I should get
No,
onto
I'm
that.
not. The note, there is a question. Is the notebook
Oh,
transcribed?
beg your pardon.
No,
Yes.
it's not. It's so that would have just been too much, I have to say. But it's when I catalogued it, I did catalogue it section by section. So if you look either on the online collections or on the archive catalogue, there will be a breakdown of all the sections and what they contain. If only a rough idea. But no, besides we like people to have an excuse to still have readers coming in to look at material. But that would have taken far too long to transcribe something like that.
Well, I think if there are no more questions, maybe we'll wrap up there. Thank you again, Isabelle, for a lovely lecture. We're hoping that this will be the first in a series of these events. The next one will take place in August. We think it will probably take place on the 24th of August at the same time. I think I'm going to be helming that one, and provisionally we're going to be looking at cyanotype impressions by a lady called Anna Atkins, who was a pioneering early photographer and botanist, and we will have a go at that. Isabelle is also holding up our latest publication in which this manuscript features, L50. It's a wonderful book, if we do say so ourselves. It is a lovely whistle-stop tour through our collections and some of our favourite objects, and I'll pop the link to the shop into the chat box at the end. But otherwise, thank you again for coming, and hopefully see some of you again towards the end of August.